You already know this country. You have seen it lift a golden trophy over a sea of pale blue and white. You have heard its music in a dozen films, watched two of its sons become the most famous footballers who ever lived, tasted the idea of its beef, its wine, its long, unhurried dinners. When most people picture Argentina, they picture glory, a beautiful European city at the bottom of the world, a place that got the good weather, the good land, and the good luck. And they are not wrong. All of that is real. But there is a second country underneath the first one. It lives on the same streets, in the same century, behind the same beautiful facades. And the people who live there have spent 100 years learning something the highlight reels never show. How to hold your dignity together while the ground gives way beneath you, again and again and again. In the largest square in the capital, once a week, a small group of women walk in a slow circle. They wear white cloth on their heads. Some of them are very old now. They have been walking that circle, in one form or another, for almost 50 years. And to understand why they cannot stop, you have to understand everything the glory was built to hide. 100 years ago, this was one of the 10 richest countries on Earth, not in the region, on the planet. Today, its people carry wads of cash into supermarkets because the money will be worth less by the weekend. How does a nation live like that? Rich and then poor, and then rich and then poor again, and keep its pride intact? This is Argentina. It hangs off the bottom of South America like the tail of the continent, the second largest country on the landmass and the 8th largest in the world. More than 2,000 miles from top to bottom. In the far north, it touches the subtropics, hot and wet, where the jungle presses against the borders of Brazil and Paraguay. In the far south, it reaches toward Antarctica, winds scoured and nearly empty, closer to the ice than to its own capital. Between those two extremes lies almost every landscape a planet can make. Desert, wetland, grassland, glacier, vineyard. The highest mountain in the Western Hemisphere, and coastlines where whales come to give birth. It is a country that seems to have been given everything, and that, in a strange way, is the beginning of the problem. To see the glory and the cost in a single frame, you go to the capital, and you stand in front of one particular building. Buenos Aires does not look like a South American city to the eye that arrives expecting one. It looks like Paris that drifted 6,000 miles south and settled by a wide brown river. Boulevards lined with plane trees, French-style palaces with wrought iron balconies, grand cafes with marble tables where the coffee is served slowly and the newspaper is read to the end. For a long time, the city called itself the Paris of South America, and for a long time, it earned the name. And at the heart of it stands the Teatro Colón, an opera house that took nearly 20 years and 3 architects to build. The first architect died, the second was murdered. The third finished the work and opened the doors in 1908 with a performance of Verdi's Aida. They imported the marble from Italy, the glass from France, the whole idea of European grandeur, and set it down in a city that wanted the world to know it had arrived. The acoustics inside are considered by many the finest of any opera house on the planet. Pavarotti once complained that they were too perfect. If you sing something badly here, he said, you notice immediately. There is nowhere to hide. And that is the thing about the Colón. There is nowhere to hide. Because in the decades that followed, the country that built this temple to beauty fell apart and put itself back together and fell apart again. And through all of it, the Opera House kept its doors open. There were years when the money to run it barely existed. There is a famous memory from one of the harder times of the theater's own orchestra out on the street, playing in the park beside the building, in t-shirts and jeans instead of formal dress, in protest. The music did not stop. It just moved outside for a while. You can walk through the Colón today, up the marble staircase, through the golden foyer that was modeled on Versailles, into an auditorium that seats nearly 2,500 people beneath a painted dome. It is exactly as grand as it was meant to be. And a few streets away, on the same afternoon, you might pass someone bent over a bin, going through the day's rubbish for something to sell or something to eat. Both of these things are Argentina. At the same time, on the same street, the Opera House and the man at the bin are not two different countries. They are the same country looking at itself. To understand how a nation ends up like this, you have to go back to where the money came from in the first place. And for that, you leave the city and you drive out into the grass. West and south of Buenos Aires, the land flattens into something enormous and green. The Pampas, grasslands so wide and so flat that the horizon becomes a perfect straight line in every direction, broken only by a windmill, a line of poplars, a distant herd of cattle. This is the soil that made Argentina rich. Some of the most fertile farmland on earth, deep and dark and seemingly without end. For a brief, dazzling moment, it made this country the barn of the world. Picture it. It is the year 1900. The refrigerated ship has just been invented, which means for the first time, beef raised on these plains can be frozen and sent across the ocean to feed the cities of Europe. Ships leave the river ports loaded with meat and grain and wool. Money floods back the other way. British engineers lay thousands of miles of railway across the grass. European immigrants pour off the boats by the millions. Italians and Spaniards and Germans and Irish, more than the country can quite absorb, all of them chasing the same rumor. That down here, at the bottom of the world, there was a place where a poor man could become something. By 1913, Argentina stood among the 10 wealthiest nations on the planet, measured by income per person. Buenos Aires had electric trams and universities and a lively press before many European capitals did. And then the world changed, and the barn was left holding grain no one was buying. The wealth had been real, but it had rested on a narrow base. It came from land and from exports, from selling raw materials to a world that would not always be hungry. When the Great Depression came and the buyers stopped buying, the country discovered it had not built the other things a nation needs to survive a shock. It had grand architecture and world-class beef, and underneath, institutions too fragile to hold when the money stopped flowing. The historian's verdict is quiet and brutal. The Golden Age was also the sentence. A country that agreed to be the world's supplier and forgot to become anything else. The cattle are still out there on the pampas. The gauchos still ride them, the horsemen of the plains who became the national symbol of a certain kind of freedom, lean and weathered and answerable to no one. On a Sunday, in 1 million homes across this country, families still gather around the asado, the slow barbecue that is less a meal than a ritual, meat cooked over wood for hours while the afternoon unwinds. It is the most Argentine thing there is. But talk to people now, and you will hear a strange grief inside that ritual. In the country that fed the world its beef, ordinary families have watched the price of meat climb until the asado becomes something you save for. That's just for birthdays, a hospital maintenance worker said, describing the barbecue his family could no longer afford every week. The land that made them famous for abundance now rations its own most famous gift. Remember that. The country that could feed 400 million people and struggles to feed the 40-odd million it has. So how did it happen? How does a nation go from the world's 10th richest to a place where the currency dissolves in your hand? The short answer is that it did not happen once. It happened over and over in cycles for the better part of a century. A boom, then a crisis, a recovery, then a collapse. Every 10 or 15 years, people here will tell you the bomb goes off again. And each time, the people who live behind the glory learn a little more about how to survive the blast. But before you can understand how people live through the crises, you have to understand the promise that shaped what they expect from their country. Because in the middle of the last century, one couple made ordinary Argentines a set of promises the nation has been arguing about ever since. In the 1940s, a military officer named Juan Domingo Perón rose to power on the strength of something the ruling class had never bothered to court: the workers. The people in the factories and the meatpacking plants, the ones the Golden Age had made rich for their labor, but never for themselves. Perón gave them wages and holidays and the vote for women and the feeling for the first time that the state in the Grand Palace on the Plaza de Mayo belonged to them too. And at his side stood a woman the country has never stopped mourning or fighting over: Eva Perón, Evita. She had come from nothing, a poor girl from a small town who became a radio actress and then the most powerful woman in the country, and she used that power to build a foundation that handed out sewing machines and medicine and houses to the poor who had never been given anything by anyone. To the workers, she was a saint. To the old elite, she was a threat. When she died of cancer at 33, the country stopped. Hundreds of thousands lined the streets. People were crushed in the crowds trying to reach her coffin. The grief was not performance. She had made the invisible feel seen, and they did not forget it. But the era was not only welfare and adoration. Perón governed with a heavy hand, silenced opponents, and left the country deeply, permanently divided between those who worshipped what he built and those who blamed him for the decades of instability that followed. He was overthrown and forced into exile, and then astonishingly welcomed back to the presidency almost 20 years later, an old man returning to a country that had spent 2 decades tearing itself apart over his memory. His body of ideas, Peronism, outlived him entirely, and to this day, it shapes almost everything about how Argentina argues with itself. The point for this story is simpler. It set the expectation that the state should protect its people. And so, every collapse that followed was felt not just as hardship, but as a broken promise. To see how people live when the promise breaks, you have to go back to the city and look not at the monuments, but at the ordinary business of getting through a month. In Buenos Aires, on the day he is paid, a man will go straight to the shops, not to celebrate, to spend, because the money in his pocket is losing value by the hour, and whatever he does not turn into food or goods today will buy less tomorrow. There was a stretch not long ago when prices rose by more than 100% in a single year. In the worst months, more than 8% in a single month. Under numbers like that, saving is not caution. It is a slow way of throwing money away. So the people invent their own defenses, and they are strange and ingenious and quietly heroic. Almost no one keeps their savings in the local currency for long. Those who can hold United States dollars, hidden at home, traded on an unofficial market at a rate that shifts by the day. Some pour whatever they have into bricks, into real estate, into anything that will still be worth something when the numbers go mad again. They switch to cheaper brands, learn to do without, buy in bulk the moment the smell of inflation returns. In this country, one woman said, "When you start smelling inflation, it's best to buy and save." The strangeness runs deeper than hoarding, though. It reaches into the value of money itself. For long stretches, this country has had not one exchange rate, but several at once. There is the official rate, the one the government prints, and there is the real one, the street rate, the price a dollar actually fetches in the informal market, whispered between people and traded in back rooms, often for far more pesos than the official number allows. Argentines learned to live inside this split, to know both numbers at all times, to understand that the price of a thing depended on which dollar you held and how you had come by it. An entire population became, out of necessity, amateur economists, fluent in a financial reality that would baffle a visitor from a stable country, tracking the gap between the official world and the true one, the way people elsewhere check the weather. And here is the detail that outsiders never expect. The restaurants are full, the theaters sell out, the queues for concerts run down the block. Because when the currency is dying anyway, people reason, you may as well spend the evening well. There is a kind of defiance in it, a refusal to let the crisis take the pleasure along with the money. A young chef, shopping for his restaurant in the middle of one of the worst inflations in the world, put it as plainly as it can be put. People are used to living without stability, he said. When the end of the month comes, people just want to enjoy themselves.
That sentence contains
The whole survival philosophy of the place. Not denial of the crisis, not surrender to it, something harder and more human. The decision to keep living a full life inside the wreckage because the wreckage is not going anywhere. And a life spent waiting for stability that never comes is a life not lived. The parents teach it to the children the way they teach them to cook, move fast on payday, trust the brick and the dollar over the peso, know both exchange rates, keep the pantry full, and never, whatever happens to the numbers, give up the dinner, the music, the long table. It is a manual for surviving the impossible, refined over 5 or 6 collapses, handed down like an heirloom. But defiance does not feed everyone. In the harder years, at the edges of the city, people wade into the garbage dumps to sort cardboard and plastic and metal to sell, and sometimes to find food. A father of 5 described spending 12 hours a day in the waste. Twice as many people are coming here, he said, because there is so much crisis. In the poorest stretches, poverty has climbed to nearly 6 in 10 people. In one district, an old survival machine from the last great collapse came back to life. A barter club, where people trade what they have, old clothes for a bag of flour, a repaired chair for a sack of pasta, because there is no money left, but there is still a need to take something home. The woman who runs it remembers the crash of 2001, when the same thing happened. People come very desperate, she said. Their salaries are not enough. And yet, this is the part that matters most. They do not, on the whole, tear the country apart. There is a moment in the reporting from one of these downturns where an analyst is asked why there are not riots in the streets. People endure this by zigzagging along, he says. They adapt. They fall back on skills their parents taught them, and their parents before that. Because unlike almost anyone in a wealthy country, The Argentine has a memory of this. 5 or 6 times since the 1930s, the economy has gone into free fall. Each generation inherits not just the trauma, but the manual. How to move fast, how to protect what little you have, how to keep the lights on and the dinner cooked and the children in school while the numbers scream. This is the real meaning of the title. This is how people live behind the glory, not by ignoring the collapse and not by being crushed by it. By becoming, over 100 years, some of the most resourceful survivors of economic chaos anywhere on the planet. And by insisting, all the while, on keeping the asado, the opera, the long dinner, the beautiful city. On staying, in spite of everything, themselves. And to see where that endurance was first forged, you go back into the capital, but not to the grand boulevards this time. You go down to the old port, where the immigrants first came ashore. The neighborhood is called La Boca, which means the mouth, because it sits at the mouth of the river where the ships came in. When the millions arrived off the boats a century ago, chasing the rumor of a better life, this is where the poorest of them landed and stayed. They could not afford the French palaces of the center. They built tenements instead, crowded wooden houses called conventillos, whole families to a room, and they clad the walls in whatever they had, in leftover sheet metal and the bright paint scraped from the hulls of ships in the harbor. That is why La Boca is a riot of color to this day. Walls of red and blue and yellow and green, not for beauty, but because paint was what the docks threw away. It was hard here. The work was brutal, the pay was thin, and the men outnumbered the women badly. Immigrants, far from home, in a language half of them did not speak. And out of that loneliness, in the bars and courtyards of the port, a music was born. Tango. The world knows it now as elegance, as the sharp suit and the rose between the teeth. But it did not start there. It started as the sound of exiles, of dock workers and the poor, a music of longing for places and people left behind across the ocean. The elegance came later. The ache came first. And its greatest composer would spend his life insisting that the ache deserved a concert hall. His name was Astor Piazzolla. He grew up partly in the streets of New York, came home to Argentina, and set about doing something the tango traditionalists found close to blasphemy. He took this music of the tenements and rebuilt it with the structures of classical composition, made it strange and dissonant and modern, and demanded it be taken seriously as art. The purists were furious. He was accused of murdering the tango, but he had understood something about his country, that the sorrow of ordinary people was not a lesser subject, that it belonged in the grandest rooms in the world. Remember that accordion sound, that specific melancholy the whole world now finds so beautiful in Argentine music. We will come back to what it really is. But the story of what people here have survived is not only economic, and not only the music that came out of the hardship. There is a darker chapter, and it does not resolve into resilience. It has to be told plainly, and then it has to be allowed to sit. In 1976, the military seized the government. What followed is remembered by a name that sounds almost gentle, and was not. The Dirty War. For 7 years, the state turned on its own citizens. Anyone the junta decided was an enemy: students, union members, journalists, activists, and many who were guilty of nothing at all could simply vanish. Taken in the night, held in secret, tortured, killed. The estimates of the dead run from 10,000 to 30,000 people. They came to be called the desaparecidos, the disappeared. The methods do not bear softening. People were murdered at the edges of mass graves. Others were drugged and loaded onto aircraft and dropped, alive, into the ocean, so that there would be no body to bury and no grave to mark. Pregnant women were kept alive only long enough to give birth. Then they too were disposed of, and their babies, an estimated 500 of them, were taken and handed to other families to raise, their names erased, their histories rewritten. And all of this happened behind the glory. In 1978, at the height of the disappearances, Argentina hosted the Football World Cup. The nation won it on home soil, in a stadium a short distance from where the killing was being carried out. The world watched the celebration. The trophy went up, the blue and white flags waved, and in the secret places, the vanishing continued. It is here that the women in white return to the story. In 1977, a group of mothers whose children had disappeared began to gather in the Plaza de Mayo, the great square in front of the presidential palace, the very center of the country's power. They did not have weapons. They did not have allies in the government that had taken their sons and daughters. What they had was a refusal to be told that their children had simply ceased to exist. They wore white cloths on their heads, made, it is said, from their children's cloth diapers, and they walked in a slow circle around the square, holding photographs, asking the only question that mattered: where are they? The regime answered the mothers with the same violence it had used on their children. One of the founders, a woman named Azucena Villaflor, was herself abducted and killed for the crime of asking. Others vanished too, and still the mothers came back every Thursday and walked their circle through the dictatorship, through the World Cup celebrations happening around them, through the years when it was dangerous simply to stand in that square and be counted. They did not stop when the dictatorship fell in 1983. They did not stop when a democratic government passed laws to protect the men who had done the killing. The grandmothers among them turned to science, to the new tools of DNA testing, and began the almost impossible work of finding the stolen children, now grown adults, and telling them who they really were. Over the decades, they have recovered more than 100 of them, given them back their names. There are more than 500 still missing, and so the search does not end. Think about what that circle in the square actually is. It is the purest thing this entire country has to teach. Not endurance as a slogan, endurance as a woman in her 80s, walking the same worn path she has walked for half a century, because to stop walking would be to agree that her child was nothing. The glory of Argentina is on its football pitches and its opera stage, but the truest measure of the place is here, in the refusal of a group of mothers to be made to forget. The country carries this history the way it carries its economic wounds, openly and without full resolution. There are still trials. There are still names being matched to graves. The past is not finished. But the willingness to keep looking, to keep asking, is itself a kind of answer. And there is a thread that runs from these mothers all the way back to the country's founding. Because Argentina's origin story is not about a conqueror who took power. It is about a man who won it and then gave it away. His name was José de San Martín. In the early 1800s, as Spain's empire in the Americas began to crack, he led armies across some of the most brutal terrain on the continent. He took his soldiers over the high passes of the Andes, through cold that killed men and mules, to strike at the Spanish forces from a direction they never expected. He liberated Argentina. Then he crossed into Chile and liberated that. Then he pushed north into Peru and helped break Spanish power there too. 3 nations owe their freedom in part to this one man. And at the peak of his power, with a continent grateful and a crown all that offered to him, San Martin did something almost no liberator in history has done. He walked away. He handed the future to others, refused to become the strongman that so many revolutions produce, and sailed to Europe, where he lived out his life in modest exile and died far from the country he had freed. He chose restraint over power. It is the country's oldest inheritance and its most quietly radical one. The idea that dignity might matter more than dominance. It is worth pausing on how strange it is that the same nation produced both. San Martin's restraint at the beginning, the junta's brutality in the 1970s, the mother's refusal in the square. Argentina contains all of it, a place capable of the highest ideals and the darkest acts, holding them in the same history, never quite resolving the contradiction. Perhaps that is what it means to be a real country, as opposed to the idea of one. You do not get to choose only the glory. Leave the weight of the capital behind now and travel out to the edges, because Argentina is not only its history, it is one of the most physically extraordinary countries on Earth, and the land itself has its own lessons about surviving where survival is hard. Go south. Keep going past the last of the farmland until the grass gives way to something older and emptier. This is Patagonia, a vast, wind-hammered expanse of steppe and mountain and coast that covers the southern third of the country and holds almost none of its people. The wind here does not gust, it leans constantly until the few trees grow permanently bent. There are estancias, sheep ranches, so remote that the nearest neighbor is a day away. There are stretches where you can drive for hours and see no living thing but a guanaco, the wild relative of the llama, watching you from a ridge. Why would anyone hold a land like this? Why stay in a place that offers so little and asks so much? Part of the answer waits on the coast, on a hammer-shaped peninsula called Valdez, jutting out into the South Atlantic. Because every winter, into the sheltered gulfs on either side of that peninsula, the southern right whales come. They travel thousands of miles of open ocean to arrive at these exact waters, the same waters their mothers used to give birth and to raise their calves in the calm before the long journey back. From the cliffs, you can watch them, dark shapes the length of a bus, rolling and breaching a stone's throw from shore. They have been doing this longer than there has been a country here to name them. A homecoming written into the blood, repeated every single year, no matter what. And they are not alone on that coast. The same shores draw colonies of penguins and elephant seals, hauled up in their thousands. And in a few narrow channels, at a few high tides each year, something happens that occurs almost nowhere else on the planet. Orcas, the great black and white hunters, come racing toward the beach and deliberately drive themselves up onto the sand, half stranding their own enormous bodies to snatch a young seal from the shallows before hauling themselves back into the water. They teach it to their young over years. It is one of the most difficult hunting techniques in the natural world, passed down, like the survival skills of the people, from one generation to the next. This is the deeper truth of Patagonia. It looks empty, but it is not. It is a place of returns. The whales return. The people who hold the estancias return each season to the same hard, beloved ground. Emptiness here is not absence. It is space enough for the things that come back.
Farther south still,
the land runs out entirely. At the very bottom sits Ushuaia, which calls itself the city at the end of the world, the last town before the open water that leads to Antarctica. And to the west, along the spine of the Andes, lie the great glaciers of the deep south, rivers of ice grinding down out of the mountains. One of them, the Perito Moreno, is among the few glaciers on Earth that is not shrinking. It advances slowly and carves great towers of blue ice into the lake below with a sound like a cannon. People stand at the railings for hours just to hear it. Now turn all the way around and go north into a completely different country wearing the same flag. In the far northeast, where Argentina meets Brazil and Paraguay, the air turns thick and warm, and the earth turns red, and the jungle takes over. Here, the Iguazu River reaches the edge of a vast plateau and simply falls. Not in one waterfall, but in hundreds spread across nearly 2 miles, a curved wall of white water plunging into a gorge wrapped in rainforest and permanent mist. At its heart is a horseshoe-shaped chasm they call the Devil's Throat, where the volume of water is so great that standing at the edge, you cannot see the bottom, only cloud rising up to meet the roar. Toucans move through the trees. The spray never stops. It is a scale of nature that makes the human beside it very small. And a few hundred miles to the south of that thunder lies one of the great secrets of the country, a place most travelers never think to visit, where Argentina keeps something it very nearly lost. The Iberá wetlands, an expanse of marsh and lagoon and floating island the size of a small country in the province of Corrientes. The name comes from the Guarani language and means shining waters, and that is exactly what it is, an immense sky mirror of channels and reed beds, one of the largest and most intact freshwater systems in South America, second only to the Great Pantanal to the north. Capybaras, the largest rodents on Earth, lounge along the banks in the sun. Caimans drift like logs. Marsh deer, the biggest deer on the continent, wade through the shallows. Giant otters, once nearly wiped out, hunt the channels. More than 350 kinds of bird move through the air above the water. But the reason Iberá matters most to this story is what it teaches about return. Because within living memory, the top of the food chain here was gone. The jaguar, the great spotted cat that once ruled these wetlands, the largest predator on the continent, had been hunted and squeezed until it vanished from Corrientes entirely. The marsh deer had been shot toward the edge of extinction. The giant otter was gone from the country. A whole living system had been hollowed out, piece by piece, the same way the economy had been hollowed by crisis. Something essential lost. And then quietly, people set about bringing it back. Over years of patient work, conservationists began to rewild the marshes. They reintroduced the giant anteater, that strange, long-nosed creature that had vanished from the region. They brought jaguars in, raised cubs, and released them, and for the first time in more than half a century, the great cat walked the wetlands of Corrientes again. And then there was the giant otter, and its return is a story of its own. This is no ordinary otter. It is the largest in the world, nearly 6 feet from nose to tail, a sleek and intelligent hunter that lives in tight family groups and works the water with a coordination that borders on the eerie. It had been hunted for its pelt until it was gone from Argentina completely, erased from the entire country. To bring it back, keepers had to raise cubs and teach them, patiently, the things a wild otter learns from its family: how to hunt, how to live in a group, how to be an otter at all, before they could ever be released. And they did. The giant otter swims the channels of Iberá once more, a species pulled back across the line from national extinction by nothing but human stubbornness and care. Species that had been erased were returned, one by one, to the water that had lost them. It is one of the most ambitious efforts of its kind anywhere in the Americas. A country that knows better than most what it means to lose things, deciding to prove that some of what is lost can be brought home. And in that same warm north, if you look down instead of up, you find a survivor with no fame at all, working underground where no one thinks to watch. The leafcutter ant. Across the tropics, these ants are common enough, but one hardy kind pushes farther south than any of its relatives, all the way down into the cold, dry country toward Patagonia, where the leaves are few and the winters bite. It survives by farming. The ants do not eat the leaves they carry in their long marching columns. They cut them, haul them underground, and use them as compost to grow a fungus, and it is the fungus they eat. An entire agricultural civilization beneath the soil, in a climate that should not allow it, engineering its own food supply out of a landscape that offers almost none. It is a small thing, an ant in the dry ground. But it is the same lesson the whole country keeps teaching, written even into its insects. When the land gives you little, you do not leave. You build the machine that lets you stay. There are corners of Argentina this journey has only brushed past, and one of them turns the whole theme of survival into something you can taste. To the west, around the city of Mendoza, the land climbs toward the Andes and turns to high desert, dry and stony, a place that by every rule should grow almost nothing. It rains barely enough to matter, and yet this is the heart of Argentine wine, some of the most celebrated vineyards on earth, rows of vines running towards snow-capped peaks under a hard blue sky. The trick is older than the country. Centuries ago, the people here learned to read the mountains as a water supply. Every summer, the high Andean snows melt, and the meltwater runs down in rivers, and the growers built a patient web of channels and ditches to capture it and carry it out across the desert, field by field, vine by vine. The dryness that should have been a curse turned out to be a gift. Because the air is so clear and the sun so strong at altitude, the grapes ripen intensely. And because there is so little rain, the diseases that plague wetter vineyards simply cannot take hold. The signature grape, Malbec, had struggled in its native France. Transplanted to this impossible desert at the foot of the Andes, it became the best version of itself. It is the same lesson again, written this time in vines and water. Take a land that offers too little and engineer it, patiently, into abundance. Above it all rises Aconcagua, nearly 7,000 meters, the highest mountain in all of the Americas, the roof of a hemisphere, watching over the desert that learned to drink from the snow. In the far northwest, near Salta, the country changes character again into something older and more indigenous. And this is the Argentina that the European facade of Buenos Aires can make you forget exists at all. Here, the land rises into the high Andes, and the air grows thin, and the villages are built of adobe, mud brick, the color of the earth around them. The Great Canyon of Humahuaca cuts through hills striped in impossible bands of color, reds and greens and violets laid down over millions of years and exposed like the pages of a book. The people here trace their roots not to the boats from Europe, but to the Andean civilizations that were here for centuries before any Spaniard arrived, and their music uses the pan flute, and the small stringed charango, and the llama still carries the load along paths worn deep by generations. It is a reminder that the country is not one story but many, and that the oldest of them were here long before the glory the world came to know. In the center sits Córdoba, the second city, with its old Jesuit heart, its university among the oldest on the continent, a reminder that there was an Argentina of the interior, thinking and building and teaching long before Buenos Aires swallowed the country's attention. And down the river lies Rosario, where the national flag was first raised and where, in a modest neighborhood, a small boy with an extraordinary gift once kicked a ball against a wall before the world knew his name. And out in the dry scrub of the center, in the sandy ground that few people ever cross, lives one of the strangest and least seen animals on the planet, an emblem of how much of this country hides in plain sight. The pink fairy armadillo. It is tiny, small enough to sit in a cupped hand, wrapped in a delicate shell of the softest rose color, with pale, silky fur beneath. It spends almost its entire life underground, swimming through the loose sand as if through water, surfacing so rarely that most Argentines will never see one alive. Scientists know very little about it. It is a small, pink secret the desert keeps, a reminder that even in a country the world thinks it knows, there are things that have never been fully brought into the light.
Because that is the thing to hold on to.
At the end of all this, the glory that the world sees is not a lie. It grew out of this same soil, these same people, this same 100 years of trouble. Remember that accordion sound, the ache that Piazzolla carried up out of the tenements of La Boca and set down in the concert halls? Here is what it really is. The melancholy the world finds so beautiful in Argentine music is not decoration, and it is not glamour. It is the sound of a people who have lost things again and again and stayed anyway and made the losing into something worth listening to. Every crisis this country has survived is in that music somewhere. The exile off the boat, the savings turned to nothing, the child who never came home. The whole 100 years played on a single instrument. When you see the trophy lifted, and the pale blue and white, and the beautiful crumbling city, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the top of something, and beneath it lies 100 years of collapse and recovery, of dollars hidden in walls and asados saved for birthdays, of a liberator who walked away from power and a generation who vanished into the dark, and a group of mothers who have circled a square for half a century rather than let the world forget. The glory is real, the cost is real, and the achievement, the true one, is not the trophy or the opera house or the golden age that slipped away. It is the endurance. It is a people who have been rich and poor again, and who have refused, through all of it, to become smaller than they are. The mothers still walk their circle. The whales still return to the Gulf. The jaguar walks the wetlands again. And every Sunday, in kitchens across a country that has been told 100 times that its best days are behind it, the fire is lit, the meat goes on, and the long afternoon begins again. This has been Argentina. Thank you for traveling with us, and we will see you on the next journey.